Here I'm beginning the painting, and I'm starting on the nose with what sort of amounts to an elaborate underpainting. Now, in the preparatory stage, I did a stain of local color, and you can see that that's very simple throughout the face and in the shadow area. And that's not going to be enough support ultimately for my form pass. And so I want to get in there with what is still thin paint. I'm using solvent to dilute this paint here, but it's certainly more opaque than the stain underneath. And I am, to some degree, conceptualizing form, imagining her nose as being three-dimensional, as having planes in space and a curved surface. And I'm working relatively quickly for how I normally work when I model form, but I am still working out of a very core central area, and I'm going form by form, really trying to mature each part as much as I can with this thinner, more diluted paint, so that when I paint form here, eventually, I'll have a very good foundation to build that form upon. And my mixtures largely consist of cadmium orange, titanium white, and raw umber. And the more modifier colors that I incorporate here that you'll see me often turning to are the alizarin crimson, the cadmium red, and the yellow ochre. And I usually go to those and mix those into my little pool of paint, which does consist of that cadmium orange, titanium white, and raw umber, to then make the color or tint the color a little bit more red, a little bit more yellow, whatever the case might be. And now here, as I begin my form pass, I start on the ball of the nose, and I'm building on top of this sort of triangle of underpainting that I built from the nose to the eyes. And now my paint is sticking very well on this little dry underpainting. I can paint much more opaquely. I'm using the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube. I'm not adding any medium, no linseed oil. I'm not cutting it with solvent. Right now, it's just the consistency of the paint from the tube. And now that can vary brand to brand. Some brands are oilier than others, some are stiffer than others, and so you have to have a certain flexibility there. But I tend to use Winsor Newton professional oil paints, and the consistency that particular paint and others like it come from the tube are usually what I need to model form, and that works very well. And my basic premise here is that I start by conceptualizing the diffuse reflection, and that would be the form as we can sort of imagine it when it's perfectly matte, having no highlights or any other effects. And from there, I imagine where the light is striking that form most directly. I mix the color that I see there, and in this instance, it's titanium white, cadmium orange, with a little bit of raw umber. And I start modeling around the curves of that form, imagining the light falling off, and therefore the value getting darker. And I also recognize when I look at things in this way that the chroma, or the saturation of color, also drops down because the form is receiving less light and we are therefore seeing less of it. Now, there's a certain little feature of form and the way material works here with flesh that I factor into this. And that is that on these semi-translucent forms like flesh, light can pass through that flesh and sort of filter further, and that can keep the chroma up sometimes a little bit higher than we might otherwise expect. And that's certainly true in areas that have a lot of cartilage under the surface rather than bone, and therefore let light pass through. So here on the nose, as I turn around the ball of the nose and the nostrils, there are areas where I keep the chroma relatively high, and I might mix an alizarin crimson and a little bit of yellow with my normal base color to keep that chroma higher so that that flesh looks more translucent. That's less the case when I get up to the glabella area, the form here between the eyebrows and the middle orbit area, because the bone's closer to the surface and we don't have that light transmitting through the translucent form as much. And so you'll notice here that I'm a little bit more neutral as I turn around that form, and that means mixing more titanium white and more raw umber into my mixture as I go around. And I'm really trying to sculpt form three-dimensionally in space here. Now, if I had a sculpture in front of me, I'd reach forward and my hand would move around that three-dimensional surface, and I wouldn't even have to think about the three-dimensional space. And with painting and our hand landing on a flat canvas, I have to really simulate that experience or that sensation as I paint so that I can convince myself that I'm actually moving around a three-dimensional surface. And when that happens, when that little switch goes off in the mind, it becomes a much more intuitive process. I'm no longer wondering exactly what the value has to be as I go around the orbit or the brow into the eyelid area. I think, no, my form just doesn't look round enough. Or it could possibly look too round. And so then I think to myself, I want it to look less round or more round, whatever the case might be. And then I do what I need to do to make that happen. Now, that could ultimately result in values becoming lighter or darker, but the impulse, the motivation or call to action to change that appearance is from a form sensibility. This idea that I'm modeling something three-dimensionally in space as if I were sculpting. And now I'm coming down to this eyelid here, and it's another form I simply isolate and task myself with rendering three-dimensionally. And I've had this maxim that I've used for quite a while. It's been in previous videos, but it's called isolate and integrate. And it's something that just runs through my mind constantly as I work. I go to a new form, I isolate it, and I imagine it three-dimensionally. I paint it, and then once it's done, I integrate it into the other forms. So I isolated the upper eyelid, painted it three-dimensionally, and then looked for the nuance and the subtle passages from that form into the brow I previously painted, and by doing that, I integrated them together. So I isolated and I integrated. And now this new area on the lower eyelid and the tear bag just underneath that, I'm isolating those forms. I'm painting them as fully and completely as I can, believing in the illusion, and then once that's done, I can integrate it into the tear duct and the surrounding orbit and the upper eyelid and brow above. And now moving to the other side, you can see I'm still building on that very limited underpainting that I began with, going to this other eye, isolating that far brow, and then isolating the eyelid just underneath, and ultimately I will seek to integrate those together. And by doing that, I have this closed network of forms that all interrelate and are all connected, and I can really start to make more and more sophisticated decisions as I see this network of forms emerge. And what I'm resisting is any temptation to zoom ahead or to just lay in another area under the belief that I need more context to make choices now. Because that's not really the case. In the beginning, it could be disorienting. When I started with that ball of the nose, I didn't have anything to compare it to, but I just committed to it and built off of it. Now, when I do the new eyelid, when I do the brow, I have the other forms that I've painted to relate that to. And when I get down to the cheeks and forehead eventually, I'll be able to relate those to everything I've done here so far at the core of the face. And with that approach, it tends to be the case that the painting gets better and better, and it might prove that the early forms I began with need to be revised, and that's perfectly fine. But to get to the level that I want to paint at, I have to paint full out and really commit to these things, or I never reach that. If I'm always massing everything in all at once everywhere, I never really reach this high standard that everything new has to live up to and hopefully exceed. And now I'm continuing this pattern where I put in a relatively simple underpainting in the next few areas that I'm going to paint. So I lay in an underpainting here on the forehead, and after that's dry, I can then use more opaque paint that's not thinned out by solvent or made fatter with oil, and I can just lay down that paint at the consistency it comes from the tube and start to sculpt this form.